to welcome everyone. My name's Jeremy Kay. Here at Checkpoint, I run our Executive Briefing Center, and I have the honor and the pleasure, it really truly is, welcoming you to a joint webinar today with both Redsift and with Checkpoint, and it's super interesting to see this collaboration. Our webinar is being delivered live and is also being streamed on LinkedIn. So a big shout out to all of you on LinkedIn and Checkmates. Thank you so much for joining. With us today are two incredible speakers who will be discussing very different aspects of business email compromise. We welcome Asil Kayal from Checkpoint and Roshni Huama from Redsift. Asil is a malware analyst at Checkpoint Research. She joined Checkpoint as a security analyst back in 2016. She received her bachelor's degree in computer science and English literature and speaks fluently Arabic, Hebrew, and English. Asil will be discussing how business email compromise takes place, and specifically will be exploring how attackers were able to steal over £1 million in the Florentine Banker attack. We also have with us Rosh, who is a doctor of law and an expert in the field of cyber governance and risk mitigation. Rosh is highly experienced in her role as head of cyber governance at Redsift. She works with key clients across a wide range of industries, and Rosh will be discussing a different aspect. She'll be discussing these types of attacks and looking at the legal implications for decision makers, including FCA censure, fines, and the case for shareholder class actions. So two speakers looking at business email compromise from very, very different perspectives. It's going to be really interesting to see this together. I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. If you have questions or points that you would like to raise, and I'm sure you will, we have plenty of time at the end. Please send them through the chat or through LinkedIn for those of you that are LinkedIn. Asil, we're going to start with you. So please take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Jeremy. As promised, today we'll be discussing the Florentine Banker, which is an attacker that our incident response team has been keeping track of for a while now. If you're interested in reading the full details of the story and taking a look at more technical aspects, I believe there is a link that is shared here, which will lead you to our research blog, so feel free to visit it and see all of the details. And our incident response team has basically what business email compromise, or BEC, is. It is when an attacker gains access or compromises a corporate email and then uses that access to steal sensitive information or money from the target. And the Florentine Banker case was no different. So malicious emails were sent on multiple occasions to organizations, usually from the financial sector. And the malicious emails were impersonating Office 365 and trying to steal credentials for that service. And the emails weren't really sent out to anyone within those organizations. They were usually going after the CEOs or the CFOs or people that are in charge of handling the organization's finances. And we can imagine this from the point of view of the attacker. So let's say the attacker managed to now compromise a CEO's email. What do they do next? What are their options? Do they then try to cash out as quickly as possible? So they access that email and then try to look for credentials, credit cards, and or do they then use that access to spread even further? So let's say the attacker can use that to send phishing links or malicious files to other victims, and the victims receiving the emails from a CEO's legitimate email address will then not be suspicious. Or lastly, would the attackers then wait and do nothing with that access? And while the third option doesn't really seem to be that interesting, this is what the attackers did in this case. And by doing that, it earned them time, because it means that if the attackers are not really doing anything straight away, the victims are less likely to be suspicious and less likely to be alert that something is going on within their inbox. And that grants the attackers time to learn about the organization and get a better understanding of it from within, and also achieve their end goal without really being interrupted and without the victim knowing or stopping that activity. And while the attackers were waiting, they certainly weren't exactly doing nothing. They were spying on the victim's correspondences or communications. So let's say the victim is talking to their bank or to another company and discussing wire transfers. The attackers would simply at first read those emails, look at those messages without any of the involved parties knowing. So they're just sitting there, not really doing anything at first. But then, when they spot the interesting messages or threads, they will want to take action. So what they did next was a bit of a creative solution. They started creating rules within the compromised email to move the interesting messages to folders that the victim visits less frequently. So in the example we have here, the messages were moved to the RSS feeds folder, which, like, come on, who reads that, who accesses that folder? And by doing that, they can isolate the interesting messages and make sure that if the bank is trying to reach out to the victim, or someone discussing a wire transfer is trying to communicate with them, the victim will not even know that they're receiving those messages. But then, of course, that resulted in a different problem. Let's say the attackers spotted those interesting conversations, the valuable messages, that interesting email thread. And now they want to reply to it. They want to take action to make sure that the wire transfer, for example, is being made to them and not to any of the involved parties, and they want to steal that money. But they want to do that without really attracting the victim's attention. Because if they send out a message from the victim's inbox, the victim will likely see that in their sent folder, etc., so they will know something is up. And yet again, the attackers came up with another creative solution. They started registering lookalike domains, meaning they were using websites that looked very similar to those that were used by the targeted organization or by the people that were talking to them. So let's say that the compromised CEO's email was johndoe@somebusiness.com. The bank would still receive a message from johndoe@somebusiness.com, except that in the latter case, the domain would be missing a letter, it would have an additional letter, it would have some sort of typo, but it would still be very, very close to the original, in the hopes that whoever receives that message wouldn't really notice that something is wrong. And we can take a look at such a case in which those hijacked threads were used and the lookalike domains were used in hijacked threads. And in this case, an Israeli startup was compromised. And at that point, they were supposed to receive a seeding fund worth $1 million from a Chinese venture capital. The money never made it to the Israeli startup because the attackers intercepted the communications and transferred the money to them. Now, while the attackers were monitoring the Israeli startup's CEO's email, they noticed that the CEO was supposed to travel to Shanghai. And during that trip, the CEO was supposed to meet an account manager from the Chinese venture capital. Now, if the account owner, the account manager, and the Israeli startup CEO met, they would have known that something is wrong with the details that were provided over email. They would have known that they didn't provide the details themselves, and they would have stopped this operation and disrupted the attackers. The attackers, noticing those messages, immediately knew they had to take actions. So they registered lookalike domains that look like the Israeli startup's website and the Chinese venture capital, and they sent individual messages to both parties canceling that meeting. Again, even though both were available. Had they not done that, the money would not have been stolen, probably. And it didn't even stop there. After they got their hands on the $1 million, the attackers kept going. They continuously sent messages, even internally within the company, to the company's CFO from the CEO, supposedly, telling them to send wire transfers to different bank accounts all over the world. Or they sent additional messages to the Chinese venture capital telling them that they need the phase 2 funding to be approved by the local government. So they certainly did not stop there. And in a recent wave of attacks by the Florentine Banker, the attackers managed to steal more than £1 million from different targets all over the world. And again, half of that amount in this case was recovered by banks who stopped the fraudulent transfers, but still half of that money made its way to the attackers. But because the attackers use lookalike domains, it means that we can gain some insight into their infrastructure. And looking at the domains that they registered, we were able to tell that by looking at the whois information of those websites, the names that were used to register the websites and the email addresses and the phone numbers were used to register additional ones that were impersonating different organizations. So by having a handful of domains that were involved in this attack, that gave us a much broader insight into the attacker's activity, and we were able to tell potential targets or even future targets that they may be going after. And that helped us understand, again, what kind of targets they were chasing or going after, and we can see that they were focusing their activity on a lot of targets in the US and Canada, but also in India, South Africa, and all over Europe. And we can ask ourselves some questions about the attackers. What has our incident response team learned from tracking all of those incidents? They saw that the attackers were only reading English conversations, meaning that in some cases where they compromised a CEO's or a CFO's email, there were very valuable threads that could have revealed sensitive information, but that were still not used by the attackers, maybe because they didn't dedicate some resources to translate them or may have overlooked them, but they were still focused on English conversations. Moreover, they were using a lot of bank accounts in the UK and in Hong Kong. And in one case, such a bank account was set up by a Hong Kong company that appeared to have been registered for this purpose. So it is an interesting choice of a place to set up that company. So if I were to summarize the Florentine Banker attacks, I would say that this is certainly not sophisticated and not unique. Again, we see those type of attacks all the time. We can really see that they may have involved a lot of human resources in terms of reviewing the emails and monitoring the victims, because the attackers were able to monitor the victims for weeks or even months in certain cases. But again, they didn't require a lot of technical resources from the attackers themselves. So again, they just had to set up domains or websites that look like their targeted organizations, not much more than that. And still, despite the fact that they didn't really need a lot of resources, it offered them a very, very, very lucrative outcome. And again, I'm talking about more than £1 million in this case, or in one wave of attacks, and their total revenue might be much higher. And again, and this is, I think, the main point that I took away from those different cases, the beauty and perhaps the scary thing about those attacks is how heavily they rely on social engineering. So again, they're not using a super advanced technique, but they're depending on the fact that whoever receives those emails, because they're receiving them supposedly from a known entity or a known individual, they will not be suspicious and the attacks will work. And it's crazy to think that all of this started from a business email compromise attack. And with that, we move over to you, Rosh.
Hasil, thank you so much. Thorough, substantive, novel. All of the heavy lifting has been done by you. I'm going to look at what we can learn from the Florentine Banker and what outcomes do we want to avoid. I will just share my screen with everyone, present, and oops. Here we go. And let me see if I can't make it so that it takes up the whole screen. Great. So, yeah, as Asil touched on in her final slides, the Florentine Banker attack is instructive and interesting because it isn't sophisticated and because it was not unique. Now that might sound like a throwaway comment, but actually it's central to today's message because it gives rise to two important issues relating to business email compromise. It's reasonably foreseeable and therefore it's preventable. So let's compare the Florentine business email compromise attack with Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a sophisticated attack, and when we learned of it in 2010, it was unique. Stuxnet, as you know, was believed to have been responsible for causing substantial damage to Iran's nuclear program, and it has been attributed to a coalition of sophisticated state actors, though it's worth noting that no one has admitted involvement. But importantly, when we're considering cyber attacks, it is worth bearing in mind that the courts do not expect directors to implement state-of-the-art solutions, but they do expect that directors will implement run-of-the-mill, common or garden variety solutions. And while the courts do not expect directors to be able to see around corners, they most certainly expect directors to be able to see the writing on the wall. Now, as with the Stuxnet example, the issue with a sophisticated and novel attack means that as a result of those characteristics, that attack was not foreseeable. You cannot prevent something that you cannot foresee. Conversely, you can prevent things which you can reasonably foresee. So when trusted independent experts, such as the National Cybersecurity Centre, part of our intelligence community here in the UK, or the FBI's reporting unit, IC3, are warning businesses on virtually a daily basis that business email compromise is the most significant cyber threat to business, then action is required. So when we say that this Florentine Banker type attack is not sophisticated, what we really want to say is it's easy. It is technically unimpressive. And when we say it's not unique, we are not kidding. It is actually the starting point for 93% of targeted cyber attacks. This is so commonplace and simple, and it is because of those characteristics that it gives rise to some rather sticky legal problems, which means that not only could you hemorrhage cash in the initial attack, but further losses will flow. So let's turn our attention to a similar attack on a listed company that took place all the way back in 2016. So this is what we know. I'm going to start off with what we know about reputational damage. The academics will tell us that there will be a 7% drop on the initial news shock, further amplified 15 to 20% on additional news flows. But let's go through the facts of this case and then we'll see what happened. So in the case of Vinci, the French construction company, an email appeared to come from the comms director to Bloomberg, the news agency, and the email contained two things. One, it contained the message that the finance director had resigned following the discovery of a black hole in the accounting. And two, it contained a link and the link went through to a website which had all of the appearances of the Vinci website. And on their communications page, the communications page echoed the message that was contained in the email. Bloomberg published the press release. The shock was instant. Immediately the market started to react. You'll remember at the outset that I said that the academics would have determined there would be a 7% drop on the initial news shock. It's worth bearing in mind at this point that Vinci knew something was going on, realized that it was the press release in Bloomberg, issued a takedown notice within 40 minutes, and this was the headline in the FT. It bypassed the 7%, lost 19% off the share value, even though it was taken down within 40 minutes. The market tremors continued, and this is what we're seeing. And why this is important is because now we can attribute a dollar figure to a direct loss. So for Vinci, we had a 7 billion wiped off the share price, and in the Florentine Banker, we had 1.1 million. So there's also indirect losses which arise, but they're difficult to assess. In the case of Florentine Banker, for example, this is, it could be a loss of further money or control and shares. But typically in the aftershock of attacks like this, what we see is additional funds being directed at remediation, PR, legal fees, insurance premiums, and finally they increase their insurance budget to protect against the very type of attack that they had just experienced. Of course, the irony is that had they taken those steps initially, they could have avoided a whole world of trouble. So the matter of a return on investments is sometimes a block to implementing standard solutions to significant problems. This overlooks the important issue. What is the return on mitigation? We'll look at some more outcomes that you need to avoid and some of the associated costs. So if you're looking to preserve the business wealth, here are a few things that you'll want to avoid. Breach of directors, class actions, GDPR and beyond, higher insurance premiums with no payout, and FCA disciplinary and fines. And we'll just dive into each of those in turn. Now we're all familiar with this risk wheel, reputation, operation, litigation, but let's abandon this top level and get straight into the weeds. So in the case of Vinci and the Florentine Banker, the value was wiped off the share price, so that the loss was felt keenly by the shareholders. In both, this gives rise to a cause of action by shareholders and of course the company itself. Under section 172, duty to promote the success of the company, a director must act in the way he considers in good faith would be most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole. And in doing so, have regard to A, the likely consequence of any decision in the long term, the need to foster the company's business relations with suppliers, and E, the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for high standards of business conduct. So this raises the question, given that it's a director's duty to promote the success of the company, as I've just framed it, do you think a director is acting in alignment with this if that director overlooks the most significant cyber threat to its own business? Companies Act continues. Section 174 is equally problematic for directors overlooking these business email Florentine Banker type attacks. So directors of a company must exercise reasonable care, skill and diligence. And this means the care, skill and diligence that may reasonably be expected of a person carrying out the functions of a director and the general knowledge, skill and experience that that person has. This raises at least two questions. Would you expect a reasonably diligent director to know that cyber threats pose a significant problem for your business? And two, would you expect a reasonably diligent director to put in place a remedy to protect against that most significant cyber threat? But if it looks like it's all bad news, well, let's just move on. So we know that the existing shareholders can make a claim under the Companies Act 2006, but actually it gets worse. The Companies Act makes clear that a claim can be brought in respect of a cause of action arising before, during, or after a person becomes a shareholder. That means that after a breach like Vinci or Florentine Banker has occurred, I would be perfectly well within my rights to purchase shares and then sue. A firm itself can become a shareholder, and there would be nothing stopping a new class of litigant arising. So the potential for this to be exploited cannot be overstated. We know that the appetite exists for shareholder class actions, and while they have not had the success to date, this is categorically due to the merits of the case. In the most recent case, directors could reasonably defend their decisions in the matter of Sharp and Blank. The judgment in Sharp and Blank provides useful guidance on the duties of directors of listed companies, as well as illustrating some of the hurdles in pursuing such claims successfully, including issues of causation. So now if it's issue of causation, that would cause a particularly sticky legal problem for directors and firms in similar Florentine Banker type attacks. Is this problem well known and understood? Yes. Who says? Only the intelligence agencies, NIST, government bodies tasked with making their country a safe place to do business, etc. Does a solution exist? Yes. Is it proportionate and affordable to deploy? Yes. Is it discoverable on reasonable inquiry? Yes. Would a reasonable IT director seek to remedy this vulnerability? But for the director's omissions to take reasonable care and secure their assets, the vulnerability remained and was exploited, easily overcoming the causation hurdle. So we know that 90% of data breaches begin with a business email compromise, Florentine Banker type attack. And we're all familiar with the fine. 4% of global annual turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. The Information Commissioner's Office is likely to take a rather dim view if a business suffers a data breach because a well-known vulnerability that could have been avoided was left open and ripe for exploitation. One can reasonably expect the fine to be at the higher end. It gets worse for affected companies. And if you don't want to see the whole thing go up in flames, Article 82 of the GDPR might do that. The GDPR also contains a provision guaranteeing a right to private enforcement. That permits any person who suffered material or, interestingly, non-material damage as a result of a data breach, the right to receive compensation from the controller or processor for the damage suffered. Outside of the headache of ICO, the business could be dealing with a class action because of a data breach. Now ready yourselves, people. If you input the word data breach into the Google search engine, the immediate organic results include law firms who are poised and ready to take advantage of the next data breach. So beyond the fine, consider the legal fees to defend the firm and add damages to that. We know how the courts make their decisions. Do directors have a duty to take care of data? Yes, GDPR. Was that duty breached? If the data is out in the wild, the answer is yes. Damage? Well, it can be non-material, and that's to be assessed. Causation. But for the director's failure to take reasonable care, would that data be in the wild? Remoteness. How remote a possibility was it that a data could be breached in this way, especially when we already know 90% of data breaches are coming in this way. So finally, you add on the cost of reputational damage, think Vinci, and think how this might be perceived by shareholders generally. But maybe insurance will come to your aid. But if you think that insurance will bite in times of crisis, you would do well to, one, review the policy for provisions relating to threats which are well known, easily discoverable, and can be guarded against. Irrespective of the provisions contained in the four corners of that document, consider Section 4 of the Insurance Act 2015. Falling under the duty of fair presentation, Section 4, knowledge of the insured. An insured ought to know what should reasonably have been revealed by a reasonable search of information available, whether that search is conducted by making inquiries or by other means. The disclosure must be of every material circumstance which the policy holder knows or ought to know. If a qualifying breach of the duty of fair presentation in relation to business insurance contracts was deliberate or reckless, the insurer can avoid paying the premium, the contract refuse all claims, and keep any of the premiums paid. So we know that insurance companies are tightening the rules related to the liability claims. We watched Zurich Insurance refuse to pay out following the NotPetya attack, and they relied on the exclusion clause relating to war. As a result, Mondelez are suing Zurich for 100 US million. Beyond this being an act of war, the most important vulnerability to patch to avoid infection by the NotPetya is the SMB flaw. This vulnerability could have been patched, was actually available in the months running up well before the NotPetya outbreak. So even if Zurich ran into trouble with the war exclusion clause, they could argue the vulnerability was well known, the patch was available, the cost wasn't prohibitive. Had the business taken reasonable steps, they could have avoided the consequences. And then, in a somewhat circular manner, even though an honest director may fail to take reasonable care and overlook the vulnerability and patch, it is a breach of director's duty to exercise care, skill, and diligence, and the loss will lie with the firm and then not with the insurance company. So depending on what your business looks like, it may be that the Financial Conduct Authority's handbook will apply. These principles are a general statement of the fundamental obligations which apply to banks, wealth management, general insurers, and so on. If the handbook does apply, the wording of principles 2 and 3 is sufficiently wide to catch firms that omit to protect their business from business email compromise or Florentine Banker type attacks. Principle 2 looks a lot like Section 174 of the Companies Act. The question to ask yourself is a firm that omits to protect itself from the most significant cyber threat conducting its business with care, skill, and diligence? And Principle 3 requires a firm to organize and control its affairs responsibly and effectively with adequate risk management systems. Whatever risk management system it has in place, did it identify business email compromise attack as a significant threat? What protection did it recommend? Was that implemented? If not, why not? And the consequences of breaching the principles, firms are liable to disciplinary actions and also fines. I promised you dollar figures on some of these fines. These are the top 5 fines for breach of Principle 3, which relates to the need to organize the business affairs with adequate risk management systems. So let's go back to the wheel. We've seen the reputational damage for a listed company. It was immediate and painful. We know that for the Florentine Banker, that's a startup business. Presumably it will look to raise cash to raise further cash to fund its business. It's going to find that a lot harder and it's going to be more expensive. They'll have to give up more control for the same amount. And then of course litigation is a veritable smorgasbord restricted by time. I've picked a number of ways a firm could, but this is not exclusive and we're all familiar with the phrase including but not limited to, and this is what you'll be looking at: shareholder class actions, breach of director's duty, ICO fines, and if you have a data breach, civil action, and then FCA fines, and so on. So look, we're all familiar with the common refrain that we hear at every cybersecurity webinar, symposium, conference, and meeting. And we're told when considering the chances of an attack, it's not if, but when. And of course, it will be a case of not if, but when, if we do not fix the most significant threats first, if we do not protect against the devices that we know criminals are relying on to gain access to your business, if we abandon our responsibility to fix the known significant threats and leave the unsophisticated and commonplace vulnerabilities to be exploited. But if it must be a case of not if, but when, it should not be the technically easy, well-known vulnerabilities that have a solution that causes problem. Let it be rather the technically sophisticated, unique attacks, because at least if it wasn't reasonably foreseeable, then it wasn't avoidable, and in that, your firm will have a defense. Thank you very much. It's me.
Okay, wow. That's really, really interesting because it's quite rare to have a combination, both from an exploration of the type of attack itself from Asil, looking at an example of the Florentine Banker and how it actually manifested. And that was really, really interesting. And then, of course, exploring not just the, the direct cost that you've lost money, but also the legal implications that you will find yourself in as a result of those types of attack. Very, very interesting to have you both on a webinar today. And I want to start off just by saying thank you to both of you. That was great. Interestingly, about 2 hours ago, I was on my LinkedIn and I saw that there's this guy called James Linton. You've probably read about him. He's known as the email prankster. He reposted, you know him.
I've heard of him,
So he reposted something that he did a couple of years ago, where quite audaciously he pranked the White House, and he pranked the CEOs of Citibank, of Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley through exactly the same sort of things. He spoofed his email, sent emails in to these people, and phenomenally starts receiving correspondence with people that think he's within these organizations. So I want to come to that point that Asil, you mentioned, and Roche, you also commented on as well, that the type of attack of the Florentine Banker, you've described it as not sophisticated. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Asil, if you can start, and then on to you, Roche. Can we just sort of get some insight into, if they're not that sophisticated, why are we being hit by them, and what can we do to protect ourselves from these types of attacks? So Asil, if you could come on first, and then Roche, I'll address that question to you as well. And of course, if anyone has questions, feel free to shoot them to me in the Q&A or in the chat. Thank you, Asil.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think I've had to answer this multiple times working in this role as to how can we stop this if this keeps happening. I think we sometimes forget that attackers can be really creative. They can sometimes know what a user is likely to click, what they're likely to fall for. They can social engineer an attack so well that sometimes, again, the user, the victim, will not really notice that anything is wrong. And I think that if we can, first off, and this goes back to the point that Roche discussed in her presentation as well, is that if this is a technique that is constantly being used by the attackers, we can use that in our advantage. So again, a security expert or a network administrator or someone who is in charge of that within an organization can raise user awareness, and I think user awareness is very critical to solving this problem. So letting users know of the potential threats that are out there, and also training them. So sending those emails, seeing what would happen, and just exposing some of the users to the threats can really help prevent such cases, because then they would know when a suspicious email arrives. Now, of course, we cannot really cover everything. There will be techniques that we are not aware of, and that is where the security solution comes in. So I think in an ideal world, there is a balance or a combination of the two, of both a security solution and user awareness. And I think both are equally important.
Okay, thank you. Roche, would you like to address that?
Well, I mean, that's such a comprehensive answer. But I would add this. No, but it is. It's like, look, first of all, we would have to know where a firm is to be able to make the determination what steps do they need to take. But that's an investigation. That's about intelligence gathering, and that's security solutions and awareness. But I would add this, because I have another opportunity to talk. The commanding officer of grand larceny at the NYPD told me this great little analogy, and he said, look, you've got a boy, and he's on his way home from school, and there's an orchard. There's two orchards. One orchard has a really high fence and like barking dogs and barbed wire, but the other orchard is like wide open and free to anyone. Which orchard is that little boy getting his apple from? And so the reason that they do this is because it's easy, because in a way we're leaving a digital door open, and it's easy for them to identify that and then exploit it. But as to the protection, a SEAL's answer, cybersecurity solution and awareness.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to address something to you, Asil, from a from a threat research perspective. We are many months now into COVID-19. We are stuck in our homes, or at least we should be stuck at our homes if we want to be responsible citizens. Which means is that traditional thieves are also stuck in their homes. So are we seeing an increase in these types of attacks, not just business email compromise, but in general, these types of attacks, because thieves are looking to pivot to digital away from their traditional enterprise? So we're seeing a rise in these attacks.
Great question. I would say in a similar way, COVID-19 had a lot of impact on the threat landscape, like it did on our lives and the way that people work and deal with everything. So we certainly saw a lot of changes in the way that attackers work. First off, we started seeing a lot of domains related to COVID-19 being registered and attackers using that theme. So this relates to my earlier point about them being very good at social engineering. So again, because everyone is worried, everyone wants to stay up to date with the latest COVID-19 news, it is a very kind of effective lure, I would say, and effective decoy content to be using in such attacks, to tell people, oh, click here to see more information about this and that, or click here to see the cure that has been discovered for COVID-19, and the list goes on. So it has certainly been used a lot in the way attackers social engineer their files or their malicious websites. And I would say that in some cases, and I don't know if this is a positive impact, but if we talk about ransomware for a bit, some of the ransomware threat actors pledged to stop attacking healthcare institutions or hospitals or people that are dealing with the COVID-19 situation. So they stopped their attacks against such organizations. So is it a good thing? I don't know, but it certainly had an effect, to answer your question.
And it's really horrifying to think that the situation is being exploited in such a way. Roche, I'm going to address a totally different topic to you, away from the threat research, more about shareholder impact. So we had on the chat, we had someone came in and wanted to discuss the shareholder loss, because you mentioned, I think it was Vinci at 19%. A reduction in in the share price at the time of the attack. However, perhaps a little unfairly, because you also described them as being fairly responsible in their public disclosure. Yet they responded quickly. They posted the event. So should companies? Am I correctly recording that, Roche? You saying that they did respond quickly, or they didn't respond quickly?
Okay, so they responded quickly as soon as it was published, but of course the deficit in their handling of it was to allow themselves to be vulnerable to it in the first place. Now, what's really interesting, if you look into the Vinci case, there was 19% was wiped off the share price. Even though that would be quite a big data set, it would have been really interesting if they'd had a certified fraud accountant or forensic analyst to look through to see, okay, so who bought when it was low, and then, or when it was at its bottom, and then was able to sell at its height, because somebody's made huge amounts of money from this, right? So the issue for the shareholders, and this is a French company, so I'm applying sort of English law, but they've been damaged by the director's failure to take proper care. And so would they arguably have had a case? That, yeah, I think they would have, but nobody pursued it. We haven't seen any cases come out of that. We did see the AMF, so that is the regulatory body for the French, come up with a very strange decision which fined Bloomberg, but all that did was evidence their lack of understanding. So I expect Bloomberg are appealing it, and I expect that appeal to be upheld.
Interesting.
I hope that answers the question.
Well, so, this person mentioned that although they did take a hit to their share price, he was commenting that if you look at the stock history, that it did eventually recover. So a question in terms of short-term versus long-term shareholder value, but also the associated reputational damage, that even if your stock price has recovered, have you recovered reputationally? So if you could just address that.
So what we know typically about, so he's right, the share price did recover, but that doesn't mean that the people who suffered the loss recovered. Do you see? If you sell because you're nervous, because there's been tremors in the market, and then the share price drops, you can lose that value. And so losses is, that's a direct loss for those guys, but we don't know because we don't have a data set. And even transactional costs would be a loss. So if you phone up your broker and say, oh my God, there's a black hole in the accounting, sell as fast as you can. Even if you recover that at a later date, you're still going to have administrative costs. He's right, they recovered most of that share price. I don't think that they fully recovered. They may have 4 years later have recovered it. But when you have a weak external cyber security posture, and maybe this is a little bit about what Asil mentioned, is educating not just people within businesses but consumers. If you have such a weak external cybersecurity posture, then it speaks to other weaknesses in their governance policies and procedures. So personally, that would be a red flag for me. And equally with the Florentine Banker attack, you have a startup company. That should be part of a business's due diligence. How seriously are they taking it? This is a most significant cyber threat to businesses. Have they patched? Have they resolved these so that they're not easy access? They're not an easy target for businesses. So I think it signals a weakness in the policy, and it certainly would raise questions, I think, about how robust the cybersecurity posture they have if they're not addressing the most significant threats.
Okay, thank you. Rosh, sorry, Asil, I'm gonna come back to Rosh on another point. I apologize. I'm gonna come back to you in a second. 1 second, I promise you. I do a lot of panels with CISOs, and we talk a lot about changes in direction, strategy, making requests for things that they want to do as a result of risk analysis. They want to make investments in technology. They come and make those requests. Should they be seeking legal and compliance input when they submit these requests? Because the impact of having their request rejected, which of course from the CISO's perspective, he considers that, or she considers that their ultimate protection. Well, I escalated the point. Yeah. I did raise it to management, so I'm clean, but they said no. Should the people deciding on budget for security investments be aware of the potential legal and compliance impact? Yeah.
So yes. Actually, so this is a stumbling block that I've seen, where you have technically sophisticated people who understand the problem and the solution, and then it's blocked, which is why I talked about return on investment, because it's something that you sometimes hear, oh, they want to know about the return on investment. There is no return on investment. It's not even a thing. It's the return on mitigation. This is a big problem. It's well known and understood. There is a solution. Anecdotally, I can reference a law firm, and I won't name it because it's a couple of years ago that it was subject to what at first appeared like a ransomware attack, but it wasn't ransomware. It was the NotPetya, and we all know that there was no intention to decrypt those files. So this law firm, what happened was that in precisely that set of circumstances, you had the person whose role and responsibility it was made the case for backups. A product was pursued, it got to procurement, and it fell apart on a single provision. And the provision related to liability, which the lawyers didn't fully understand. And so the company wasn't then able to bring the product on. And then a few years later, that's precisely the product that would have kept their doors open. Instead, they had to shut down for a couple of weeks. And, they were really firefighting. And with, fair play, they did a tremendous job to recover some of the stuff. But we'll never know the losses that they incurred as clients fled out the door with what was left of the commercially sensitive. So I would say to anybody in that position, it's important that you take contemporaneous notes, that you put them on express notice, and just say, I'm going to record that you've rejected this. If it comes up, are you comfortable with that? Yeah, great. And then leave it, because there's only so much agitating that you can do. But I have spoken with Fortune 500 CISOs, and so I've spoken with about 40 Fortune 500 CISOs, and each of them I've asked, does your board listen to you? And these are businesses with very robust external posture, and all of them say yes. 100% of them. It was kind of not interesting for me to write an article on it, because it was like, 100% of the 40 that I spoke to said, yeah, it was interesting. Yeah.
Okay, a little going to go technical. So Asil, I'm going to come to you. So we've had a question in which is interesting, which is a general cybersecurity question. We're being asked, what tools can I use to protect my son's iPad to prevent him from clicking on pop-up ads? And before you answer, Asil, just from a business perspective, we are hearing more and more, as people are now working from home, there has been an increase in device sharing. So I've now got my laptop, and I've got my work phone, and I've got perhaps my work iPad, and it's now no longer just mine. My kids want to download a game, my kids are doing their stuff. Not everyone has, 5, 6 screens in the house, and all the kids are doing homework. So there's a lot more sharing of screens and sharing of technology, which means our kids are on these devices. So just a general question, how do we stop them clicking on pop-up ads? And that's both, I guess, for us as individuals, but also specifically, how do we educate our kids to do that?
Very interesting question. I would say, as a disclaimer, I do not own any Apple product, so I'm sorry if this is like less relevant to an iPad, but I would say you can install security solutions even for devices at home. You can have an antivirus on the device, and again, it will stop a lot of the popular attacks that we see. And again, like you said, Jeremy, especially because a lot of us are working from home now, and again, like if it's students instead of going to school or to university, and they can still use that on their own devices. You can also have ad blockers to stop the ads from being displayed, or the pop-up ads from being displayed. But again, and this really goes back to my first point, and I just feel like a broken record because I keep repeating the same thing, but user education. The question was about someone's son, so I'm sorry, I don't know how old your son is, but I think if you start from a young age raising the awareness about all of the threats that are out there, and if you tell them not to click those things, and if you explain, and especially because we're seeing that shift from going to school to studying at home to having to access Zoom sessions and having to do homework online and so on, this just shows how important this access is becoming in our life, and yet we're not aware of all the security risks. So if we can fight the things that are obvious, such as, don't click there, or don't download that, and don't click on the file which you don't know and someone random sent to you, we can definitely prevent a lot, and I'm talking about a lot of the known cases. So I hope that answers it.
No, that's great. Thank you. In fact, I share, I'm working at home, of course, like many of us. And I share, I work from my son's Fortnite room. So he's always seeing what I'm doing. And he said to me the other day, he said, "Dad, you left the room and you didn't lock your laptop." So I'm happy to see that he's picking up on some classic security controls. All right. So, firstly, I want to thank Roche. I want to thank you and Asil. Really, really super interesting. For all of you listening or watching, you have their contact details on screen. Please be in touch. In a couple of weeks, 15th and 16th of July, Checkpoint have a virtual conference, Checkpoint Secure. It's going to be really, really interesting, exploring post-pandemic cybersecurity landscape analysis. We're going to send out the link to all of you, and we'll be sending out the slides to all of you that have participated. So everyone, stay safe, stay secure, be well, and thank you so much. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you so
Jeremy.
much. Bye, Asia.
Bye.